The stories of Isaac Smith Potter and the Ike Potter gang of the Black Hawk War have to be some of the most fascinating chapters of Utah state history, but it's totally been written out of the books because it's such a complicated page of history, a lot of people would prefer to forget it. Now, Ike Potter was considered in his day and age an outlaw, but with some historic perspective, we can see that he was engaged in a blood feud with the local bishop here in Colville, which was at the time kind of the political seat of Summit County. And this was because the bishop was a military man. He was actually involved with attempting to save Joseph Smith when he was in the Carthage jail. He was a general in the Nauvoo Legion. He would have known Mormon militarism and vigilantism very well, so he was not a good man to pick a fight with. And the bishop had a thing for Ike Potter's wife, a woman named Mary Ford. And he said, you know, Ike, I could seal my marriage to her in heaven. I could just make it so that when you die, you see that I am standing next to her, and she's no longer your wife. And Ike Potter said, you know, that would make me very angry, Bishop. And the bishop said, well, you know, what are you going to do? So the bishop marries two of Mary Ford's sisters, and then starts telling Ike, you know, I could also marry her youngest daughter. Well, when Mary Ford dies, he does seal the marriage in heaven without the permission of either Mary or Ike. And this is the moment that Ike kind of turns into a folkloric outlaw figure, although again, there's very few references online to what specifically he did. Now at the time, you had a Black Hawk War that was kind of bubbling up. It was a moment at which outside officials were coming in to try to wage a war. Chiefly, this was done by Patrick Edward Connor. He was anti-Mormon, and his troops with the 3rd California Volunteers, they were all gold miners, and it was the Civil War. His plan was to have his troops sent to Virginia, but they told him to just police the California Trail, the Oregon Trail, protect them, and then maybe if the Mormons have an uprising, to put it down. Well, Patrick Connor, he desperately wanted to kill some Confederates, but he was chasing glory. And because they wouldn't let him, he had an overzealous attitude at dealing with the Native Americans. So in 1863, he initiated the Bear River Massacre. He marched his troops up from Camp Douglas, and he massacred 250 men, women, and children at a camp that really was no threat to them. So Ike Potter caught wind of this, and he was very friendly with the Indians. He liked them, but at the time there was a mass hysteria amongst Mormons. And remember, Ike Potter was himself a Mormon, but there was a mass hysteria amongst the Mormons that were living in these areas that the Indians were going to initiate an uprising, particularly under Chief Black Hawk, who was their old ally and who had actually killed the Timpanogos and Chief Old Elk alongside the Mormons. Now, Black Hawk saw that his way of life was being wiped out, and the Mormons were very scared. So selling guns to the Indians at this time was a hanging offense. Aiding them in any way was a hanging offense. So they found out that Ike Potter caught wind that Patrick Connor was going to massacre them in Spanish Fork Canyon the following spring from the Bear River Massacre. And he said, you know, you killed 200 plus Indians. I'm going to go warn them because they were defenseless up at Bear River. I'm going to go send them a warning. Well, he was a marked man. He saved probably hundreds of lives, but he had marked himself for death. And at that point in time, you know, he'd already been arrested dozens of times, but the problem was at the time, Utah was a territory. So the sheriff would be Mormon, and the mayor would be Mormon, and all the bishops, of course, were Mormon, but all of the state-appointed officials, the territorial officials, they were anti-Mormon. So the sheriff would issue kind of a warrant for stealing strawberries or rustling chickens or something small, and they would take in Ike Potter and his gang, and then he would immediately be found not guilty by the anti-Mormon judges because they understood that there was a dispute between Ike Potter and the Mormon leadership of Colville and Summit County. Well, they took him in one last time for stealing horses. And or actually stealing an ox. They took him into the Old Rock Schoolhouse in Colville, which was probably the strongest stone structure in town, and he figured, you know, I'm going to be let off. And on top of this, he'd also made it very clear in town that if you take me in and you don't intend to release me, I've got Chief Black Hawk with his troops up in the mountains. It was probably a very empty, hollow threat, but he said, you know, if you kill me, this whole town will be wiped out. So they organized the militia, and keep in mind, the bishop himself is a general in the Nauvoo Legion, so they're all acting under his command. Well, at midnight on August 1st, 1867, they show up at the county school, at the jail cell that he is being held in with two of his friends, and they say, you better let him out. Well, they let him out, and it's very clear what's going to happen. So they were probably Danites. What I say this is because the Danites officially stopped existing in 1838, but they kind of continued in the minds and the hearts of the people for quite a few years afterwards. And because the bishop was probably a member of the Danite, I think they were kind of acting on orders of the bishop. Well, they stacked them in an order where, let's say I'm Ike Potter. I have one guy behind me, one guy in front of me, and one guy next to me who's holding the rifle. And they start marching them out of town, and that is apparently the order which they marched the people out of Mountain Meadows before, at a signal, they would all move their guns and shoot them in the heads. So that massacre happened very quickly because it was just a single movement and everybody that was next to you would die. So at some point, one of the men screams, "Ike, they plan to kill us, they're marching us out of town to kill us." And they immediately shove the barrel of the shotgun in his mouth, and the massacre goes just as fast as you'd expect. He gets the top of his head blown off, Ike Potter is shot in the side and he dies, and the one man that was at the very head of the group, he manages to run. He's shot in the leg and in the side, but he manages to make it dozens of miles over to Camp Douglas, which is the headquarters of the US military. And he kind of leverages the fact that he was part of the Ike Potter gang, who was opposed to the Mormon leadership in Summit County. And they say, "We'll protect you, but you gotta realize as soon as you leave this camp, they're going to kill you." And months pass before this last member of the Ike Potter gang says he wants to go see his mother. And they give him one final warning, and he walks out the front part of the camp, and as soon as he heads up the canyon, he was never seen or heard from again.